Let me tell you a story that will break your heart before it heals it. It's about a woman named Elena and how she learned the difference between love and control, between a prison and a home, between a man who claims to own you and one who helps you remember who you are. Elena was 28 when she met Richard at an art gallery opening downtown. She was there showcasing her photography intimate portraits of elderly couples who had been married for decades, their weathered hands intertwined, their eyes still sparkling with the same love they'd shared for 50, 60, sometimes 70 years. She called the collection Forever Love, and she believed in it with every fiber of her being. Richard appeared beside her as she nervously adjusted one of her photographs on the wall. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than she made in 3 months. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his smile confident and warm. "These are extraordinary," he said, his voice smooth like expensive whiskey. "You've captured something most people spend their entire lives searching for." Elena felt her cheeks flush. She'd been ignored by most of the gallery visitors that night, her work overshadowed by more established artists. "Thank you," she whispered, tucking a strand of her auburn hair behind her ear. I think real love is the most beautiful thing in the world." "So do I," Richard said, and when he looked at her, Elena felt like she was the only person in the room. "I'm Richard Harrison, and you're about to become very important to me." He wasn't lying. For the next 6 months, Richard pursued Elena with an intensity that took her breath away. He sent flowers to her tiny apartment every Monday. Not just any flowers, but rare orchids that cost more than her weekly groceries. He took her to restaurants where she'd never dreamed of eating, places where the waiters knew him by name, and the wine cost more per bottle than she paid for rent. Elena had grown up in a modest household in a rural town. Her father was a high school teacher, her mother a nurse. They'd loved her fiercely but simply, and she'd never experienced anything like Richard's grand gestures. When he flew her to Paris for a long weekend, when he surprised her with diamond earrings that sparkled like captured starlight, when he told her she was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen, Elena felt like Cinderella. "You're different from other women," Richard would whisper as he held her close in his penthouse apartment overlooking Elliott Bay. "You're pure, innocent. You haven't been corrupted by this world like the others." Elena didn't understand what he meant by the others, but she was too intoxicated by his attention to ask. She was a small-town girl who'd moved to the city to pursue her art, working 3 part-time jobs to afford her cramped studio apartment. She'd had a few relationships, but nothing serious, nothing that made her feel the way Richard did, like she was precious, like she was chosen. When Richard proposed after 8 months, Elena said yes through tears of joy. The ring was enormous, a 3-carat diamond that caught the light and threw rainbows across her face. The wedding was everything she'd dreamed of as a little girl, a fairy tale ceremony at the Four Seasons with 300 guests, most of whom she didn't know. Her parents looked overwhelmed but happy, her father uncomfortable in his rented tuxedo, her mother crying as she watched her daughter marry this successful, handsome man who seemed to worship the ground she walked on. "I promise to love, honor, and protect you for the rest of my life," Richard said during their vows, his voice strong and certain. "You will never want for anything, Elena. You are mine now, and I am yours." The word mine should have been a warning, but Elena was too blinded by love to hear it. The first few weeks of marriage were perfect. Richard had insisted Elena quit her part-time jobs. "My wife doesn't need to work," he said, kissing her forehead. "Your only job now is to be happy and to take care of our home." Their home was a sprawling mansion in Palm View Heights, with 7 bedrooms, a wine cellar, and grounds that seemed to stretch on forever. Elena had never lived anywhere so beautiful, but she felt lost in all that space. She'd given up her tiny apartment, her independence, her small circle of photographer friends who couldn't afford to socialize in Richard's world. "I miss my camera," she told Richard one morning over breakfast on their marble kitchen island. "Maybe I could set up a darkroom in one of the spare bedrooms." Richard's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Something flickered across his face, so quickly Elena almost missed it. "Darling, why would you want to do that? You have everything you need here. Besides, those photographs you used to take, they were amateur work. You're a Harrison now. You don't need hobbies." The words stung, but Richard softened them with a smile and a gentle kiss. "I just want you to enjoy being my wife. Is that so wrong?" Elena told herself he was right. She had everything: a beautiful home, a husband who adored her, financial security she'd never dreamed of. So why did she feel so empty? The changes began slowly, like a tide creeping in. First, it was Richard's questions about her day. "Who did you talk to? What did you do while I was at work? Why did you go to the grocery store when we have a housekeeper for that?" Elena tried to explain that she was lonely, that she needed something to do, but Richard always had an answer. "If you're lonely, spend time with my mother. She'd love to take you shopping." Richard's mother, Margaret, was a cold woman who looked at Elena like she was a gold digger who'd somehow tricked her precious son into marriage. Their shopping trips were exercises in humiliation, with Margaret making subtle comments about Eleanor's background, her clothes, her lack of sophistication. "Richard could have married anyone," Margaret said one afternoon as they sat in an expensive boutique. "Caroline Whitmore was absolutely devastated when he chose you instead. She comes from such a good family." Elena smiled and nodded, but each comment was like a small knife to her confidence. She began to believe that maybe she wasn't good enough for Richard, that maybe she should be more grateful for what he'd given her. Then came the phone calls. Elena's college roommate, Sarah, called one evening while Richard was in his study. They'd been talking for maybe 10 minutes, catching up on old times, when Richard appeared in the living room doorway. "Who is that?" he asked, his voice sharp. "Just Sarah, my friend from—" "Hang up." Elena blinked. "What?" "Hang up the phone, Elena. Now." Elena's hand trembled as she told Sarah she had to go. After she hung up, Richard sat beside her on the couch, his voice gentle again. "Sweetheart, I heard you talking about me, about our marriage. That's private between us. I don't want you discussing our personal life with people who don't matter. Sarah is my friend. Was your friend. You have a new life now. Those people from your past, they don't understand what we have. They'll try to poison you against me because they're jealous." Eleanor wanted to argue, but Richard looked so hurt, so vulnerable. He pulled her into his arms and held her tight. "It's just you and me now, Elena. That's all we need. Isn't it?" Elena nodded, even though something inside her was screaming. The isolation grew worse. Richard installed a security system that tracked when she came and went. "It's for your safety," he explained. "There are a lot of dangerous people out there who might try to hurt you to get to me." He hired a driver, James, who reported back to Richard about everywhere Elena went. When she asked to drive herself, Richard looked at her like she'd suggested something insane. "You don't need to drive, darling. James will take you anywhere you want to go." But when Elena asked James to take her to visit her parents in Oregon, Richard intervened. "They can come here if they want to see you. You don't need to go running back to that little town every time you're feeling nostalgic." Elena's parents did visit once. Her father was quiet and uncomfortable. Her mother kept asking if she was happy. Elena wanted to tell them the truth, that she felt like a beautiful bird in a golden cage. But Richard never left them alone together. He hovered constantly, his hand on Elena's shoulder, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. After they left, Richard was angry. Your father doesn't approve of me, I could see it in his eyes, and your mother kept asking you strange questions. What have you been telling them about our marriage? Nothing, Elena said, which was true. She hadn't told anyone about the growing control, the way Richard checked her phone every night, the way he'd started making comments about her appearance. You're gaining weight, he said one morning, looking at her with disappointment. I fell in love with a woman who took care of herself. Elena looked down at her body. She'd gained maybe 5 pounds since the wedding, stress weight, comfort weight from the loneliness that was eating her alive. She started skipping meals, spending hours on the treadmill in their home gym, trying to become the woman Richard wanted her to be. But it was never enough. When she lost the weight, he criticized her hair. When she changed her hair, he didn't like her clothes. When she bought new clothes, he said she was spending too much money. I work hard for this lifestyle, he said. The least you could do is appreciate it instead of being so selfish. Elena began to believe she was selfish. She had everything. Why wasn't she grateful? Why couldn't she just be happy? The worst part was the way Richard could switch between cruelty and tenderness in the space of a heartbeat. After a particularly vicious argument about Elena's attitude, he would appear with flowers and apologies, holding her while she cried, telling her he loved her so much, it made him crazy. I'm sorry, baby, he would whisper. I just love you so much I can't stand the thought of losing you. You know I'd die without you, right? Elena would nod and forgive him, because what else could she do? She had nowhere to go, no money of her own, no friends left to call. Richard had made sure of that. Then came the accusations. Elena was in the kitchen one afternoon when Richard stormed in, his face twisted with rage. Who is he? He demanded. Who is who? Elena asked, genuinely confused. The man you're fucking. Don't lie to me, Elena, I can see it in your face. Elena felt the blood drain from her cheeks. Richard, I haven't, there's no one. I would never. Then why did James see you talking to a man at the coffee shop yesterday? Elena's mind raced. Yesterday, she'd asked James to stop at Starbucks. An elderly man had held the door for her, and she'd thanked him. They'd maybe exchanged 10 words about the weather. That was just a stranger, she said. He held the door. And you smiled at him. James said you smiled. I was being polite. Richard's hand slammed down on the kitchen counter so hard Elena jumped. My wife doesn't smile at other men, ever. Do you understand me? Elena nodded, tears streaming down her face. This was insane. She was living in a nightmare, but she couldn't wake up. The irony was that while Richard was accusing Elena of infidelity, he was the one having an affair. Elena found the evidence by accident, a receipt from a jewelry store for a bracelet she'd never seen, strange charges on their credit card, the smell of unfamiliar perfume on his shirts. When she confronted him, Richard turned it around on her so expertly that Elena wondered if she was losing her mind. You're being paranoid, he said, his voice patient but condescending. This is what happens when you spend too much time alone, Elena. Your imagination runs wild. Maybe you need to see a therapist. But Elena wasn't imagining the woman's voice she heard in the background when Richard thought he'd hung up his phone. She wasn't imagining the way he'd started working late 3 nights a week, or the way he'd become even more controlling, as if his guilt was making him project his own betrayal onto her. The woman's name was Victoria, and she was everything Elena wasn't. Sophisticated, cold, ambitious. She worked at Richard's company, and she had no problem being the other woman. Elena discovered this when she found texts on Richard's phone, messages so explicit and cruel they made her physically sick. Your little wife is so pathetic, Victoria had written. How do you stand being married to such a mouse? She's convenient, Richard had replied. And she'll never leave. She has nowhere to go. Elena stared at those words for a long time, her heart breaking into pieces so small She thought they might never fit back together. She'd become a convenience to the man who'd once promised to love her forever. That night, Elena stood in the bathroom of their master suite, looking at herself in the mirror. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her. She'd lost so much weight her clothes hung loose on her frame. Her eyes were hollow, her skin pale. She looked like a ghost of the vibrant woman who'd once believed in forever love. She started crying then, really crying, for the first time in months. She'd been holding it all in, trying to be the perfect wife Richard demanded, but she couldn't anymore. She sobbed for the dreams she'd lost, for the woman she used to be, for the love she'd thought was real but had turned out to be a beautiful lie designed to trap her. She was still crying when she walked out into the garden behind their house. It was nearly midnight, and the grounds were dark, except for the soft glow of landscape lighting. Elena didn't care. She needed air, needed space, needed to be anywhere but in that house that felt like a mausoleum of her former self. She sat on a stone bench near the rose garden, hugging herself as the tears continued to fall. That's where Diego found her. Diego was the estate's head gardener, a man in his early 30s with kind eyes and hands that were gentle despite years of hard work. He'd been working for the Harrisons for 2 years, and he'd watched Elena's transformation with growing concern. He'd seen her wandering the grounds like a lost soul, had noticed how she jumped when Richard spoke to her, how she'd stopped smiling. "Mrs. Harrison," he said softly, approaching carefully. "Are you okay?" Elena looked up at him through her tears, and for the first time in months, she saw genuine kindness in someone's eyes. Diego was holding a small towel. He'd been working in the greenhouse, and he offered it to her without question. "I'm sorry," Elena whispered, taking the towel. "I shouldn't be out here. Richard doesn't like me to." "You can be wherever you want to be," Diego said gently. "This is your home too." Elena laughed bitterly. "No, it's not. It's his home. I'm just something he keeps here." Diego sat on the far end of the bench, giving her space but offering silent support. "You want to tell me what's wrong?" Elena looked at this man who was essentially a stranger, and for some reason, she found herself talking. She told him about the isolation, about Richard's accusations, about how she felt like she was disappearing a little more each day. "I used to be someone," she said, her voice breaking. "I used to have dreams and friends, and I used to matter. Now I'm just this thing he owns, this doll he dresses up and shows off when it suits him." Diego listened without judgment. His dark eyes filled with compassion. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You still matter," he said finally. "You're still someone. Your husband may have convinced you otherwise, but he's wrong. You are not a possession, Elena. You're a human being with worth and dignity, and no one has the right to take that from you." Elena had forgotten what it felt like to be seen as a person rather than an object. Diego's words were like water to someone dying of thirst. That night began a friendship that would save Elena's life. Diego would find excuses to work near the house when Richard was gone, and Elena would come outside to talk to him. At first, their conversations were careful, surface level. But gradually, Elena began to remember who she used to be. Diego told her about his own life, how he'd come from Mexico as a child, how he'd worked his way through college studying horticulture, how he'd taken this job to gain experience before starting his own landscaping business someday. He spoke about his dreams with a passion Elena had forgotten existed. "Plants are like people," he told her one afternoon as they walked through the rose garden. "They need the right conditions to thrive. Too much control, too little light, and they wither. But give them what they need: space, nutrition, care, and they can grow into something beautiful." Elena understood the metaphor. She was a plant that had been kept in darkness for too long. Slowly, Elena began to change. Not on the outside. She was still careful to be the perfect wife when Richard was around. but on the inside. Diego reminded her that she used to be a photographer, that she used to have dreams. He encouraged her to start taking pictures again, even if it was just with her phone. Art is expression, he said. And expression is what makes us human. Don't let anyone take that from you. Elena started secretly photographing the garden, the way light filtered through leaves, the intricate patterns of flower petals. It was a small rebellion, but it felt like reclaiming a piece of her soul. As the months passed, Elena's feelings for Diego grew. It wasn't just gratitude, though she was grateful for his kindness. It was something deeper: respect, admiration, and yes, love. Real love. The kind that didn't seek to control or diminish but to lift up and celebrate. Diego felt it too, though he was careful never to cross any lines. He'd seen what Richard was capable of, and he knew that any impropriety would only make things worse for Elena. But he couldn't hide the way he looked at her, the way his voice softened when he spoke to her, the way he seemed to glow when she smiled. "You have the most beautiful soul," he told her one evening as they sat in the garden watching the sunset. "I hope someday you'll remember that." Elena's heart ached with longing, not just for Diego, but for the life she could have had, the woman she could have been. She was falling in love with a man who treated her like she was precious, not because he owned her, but because he saw her worth. The end came suddenly, the way these things often do. Richard had been growing more suspicious of Elena's improved mood, her small acts of independence. He'd started questioning her more intensively, checking her phone more frequently, watching her with the cold calculation of a predator. One evening, he followed her into the garden and saw her talking to Diego by the fountain. They weren't touching, they never touched, but Richard saw the way they looked at each other, and his rage was instant and terrible. "Get in the house," he snarled at Elena. "Now!" Elena obeyed, her heart pounding with fear. From the kitchen window, she watched Richard screaming at Diego, saw the quiet dignity with which the gardener accepted the abuse. When Richard stormed back inside, his face was flushed with fury. "Pack your bags," he said to Elena. "What?" "We're going to the lake house. Tonight. You clearly can't be trusted here." Elena felt panic rising in her throat. The lake house was isolated, 3 hours away from the city. If Richard took her there, she might never escape. "Richard, please." "Don't." His voice was deadly quiet. "Don't say another word. I know what you've been doing with that gardener. Did you think I was stupid? Did you think I wouldn't notice?" "We haven't done anything." Richard's hand shot out and grabbed her chin, his fingers digging into her skin. "Don't lie to me. I saw the way you looked at him, my own wife, whoring herself out to the help." Elena closed her eyes, feeling the last of her hope crumble. This was her life now. This was all it would ever be. But that night, as Richard slept beside her with one arm possessively across her waist, Elena made a choice. She couldn't live like this anymore. She couldn't let Richard steal whatever remained of her soul. She slipped out of bed and quietly packed a single bag with essentials. She left behind the jewelry, the expensive clothes, everything Richard had used to define her worth. She took only her phone, some clothes, and a small photo of her parents. Diego was waiting by the garden gate. Elena had texted him from the bathroom, a simple message. "Help me." He'd responded immediately. Always. They drove through the night to a small apartment Diego had found across town. It was tiny, nothing like the mansion Elena was leaving behind, but it felt like freedom. "You're safe now," Diego said, as they stood in the small living room. "He can't hurt you here." Elena looked around the modest space. Second-hand furniture, but it was clean and warm. For the first time in 2 years, she felt like she could breathe. "I don't have any money," she said, the reality of her situation hitting her. "I don't have anything." "You have yourself," Diego said. And that's worth more than all his money. Elena started crying again, but these were different tears. These were tears of relief, of grief for the years she'd lost, of hope for what might come next. Diego held her while she cried, and for the first time in her marriage, Elena felt truly safe in a man's arms. The next few months were the hardest of Elena's life, but also the most rewarding. She filed for divorce, despite Richard's threats and manipulations. She found a job at a local photography studio, starting at the bottom but slowly rebuilding her skills and confidence. Diego was there through all of it, patient and supportive, never pushing but always present. Their relationship grew slowly, built on friendship and mutual respect rather than possession and control. Meanwhile, Richard's life was falling apart. Unable to find Elena and punish her as he'd planned, he took his rage out on Diego, firing him immediately. But his vindictiveness backfired. In his fury, he moved Victoria into the house, making their affair public. Victoria, however, wasn't the meek woman Richard expected. She'd been playing her own game, and now that she had access to his wealth and social position, she showed her true colors. She threw extravagant parties, spent his money recklessly, and when Richard tried to control her the way he'd controlled Elena, she fought back viciously. "You think you can treat me like you treated that pathetic wife of yours?" Victoria sneered during one of their epic fights. "I'm not some small-town mouse you can intimidate." She made Richard's life a living hell, and when she finally left him, she took screenshots of his abusive messages and shared them with everyone in their social circle. Richard's reputation was destroyed, his business relationships crumbling under the weight of his exposed true nature. The divorce proceedings were brutal. Richard fought Elena for every penny, but his own behavior worked against him. The court awarded Elena half of everything, plus alimony. She'd entered the marriage with nothing, but she was leaving it with enough money to build a new life. Elena used part of her settlement to help Diego start his own landscaping business. They'd fallen deeply in love by then, their relationship a testament to what love could be when it was built on respect and equality rather than control and fear. Their wedding was everything Elena's first wedding hadn't been: small, intimate, surrounded by people who truly loved them. Elena wore a simple white dress she'd chosen herself, and when Diego looked at her walking down the aisle, his eyes filled with tears of joy rather than possession. "I promise to love you, honor you, and stand beside you," Diego said during their vows. "Not to own you, but to support you. Not to control you, but to celebrate who you are." Elena's parents were there, beaming with happiness at seeing their daughter truly happy for the first time in years. Even the small photography studio where Elena worked had closed for the day so her colleagues could attend. 2 years later, Elena and Diego's landscaping business was thriving. Elena had become the company's artistic director, combining her photography skills with Diego's horticultural expertise to create stunning garden designs. She'd also started offering photography services for weddings and events, slowly rebuilding the career Richard had tried to destroy. Richard, meanwhile, had lost everything. His business had collapsed under the weight of his damaged reputation. Victoria's public exposure of his abusive behavior had made him toxic in their social circle. He'd gone through a series of failed relationships, each woman eventually seeing through his charm to the controller beneath. One day, desperate and nearly broke, Richard swallowed his pride and approached Elena and Diego's business. He needed work, any work, and he knew they were successful. Elena was in the office when he walked in, and for a moment, she felt that old fear rise in her throat. But then she looked at this man who had once seemed so powerful, so intimidating, and saw him for what he really was, a broken, pathetic person who had used cruelty to mask his own weakness. "I need a job," Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper. I know you have no reason to help me, but— You're right, Elena said calmly. I have no reason to help you, but I'm going to anyway, because that's the difference between us. You destroyed people because you could. I'm going to help you because I choose to. She hired him as a day laborer, the lowest position in the company. Richard, who had once lived in a mansion and worn $1,000 suits, now spent his days digging in the dirt for minimum wage. Elena treated him exactly as she would any other employee. Professionally, fairly, but with no special consideration for their past relationship. She watched him struggle with the physical labor, saw the shame in his eyes when he had to ask for instructions, witnessed his gradual realization of how completely their positions had reversed. Sometimes, during lunch breaks, Elena would catch Richard watching her and Diego together. He'd see the way Diego's face lit up when Elena entered a room, the way he listened to her ideas with genuine interest, the way he supported her dreams instead of trying to control them. Richard was seeing real love, perhaps for the first time in his life, and understanding what he'd thrown away. But Elena felt no satisfaction in his suffering. She'd learned that revenge was a poison that hurt the person carrying it more than its intended target. She'd found peace, love, and purpose, and those gifts were worth more than any punishment she could inflict on the man who'd tried to destroy her. One evening, as Elena and Diego were closing up the office, Richard approached them hesitantly. "Elena," he said, "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. I know that doesn't mean anything now, but I need you to know that I realize what I did to you was wrong. You deserved so much better." Elena looked at him for a long moment. "You're right," she said finally. "I did deserve better, and now I have it." She took Diego's hand and walked toward their car, leaving Richard standing alone in the parking lot with his regrets. As they drove home to the small house they'd bought together, a house filled with Elena's photographs and Diego's plants, a house that was truly theirs, Elena reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She'd learned that love wasn't about possession or control. It wasn't about grand gestures or expensive gifts. Real love was about seeing someone's true self and cherishing it, about supporting each other's growth rather than stunting it, about building together rather than tearing down. She'd also learned that she was stronger than she'd ever imagined. The frightened, isolated woman who'd cried in the garden that night seemed like a different person now. Elena had discovered that she could survive anything, that she could rebuild her life from nothing, that she could choose love over fear. Most importantly, she'd learned that sometimes the people who save us aren't the ones we expect. Sometimes it's not a knight in shining armor who rescues the princess from the tower. Sometimes it's a gentle gardener who reminds her that she has the power to save herself, and that there's a whole world of light waiting for her outside the darkness. Elena never took that lesson for granted. Every morning when she woke up next to Diego, every time she looked through her camera lens and saw beauty in the world, every time she watched a plant bloom in the garden they'd created together, she remembered. She had chosen this life. She had fought for it, worked for it, and earned it. And it was more beautiful than any fairy tale she'd ever imagined as a little girl, because it was real and it was hers, and no one could ever take it away from her again. The woman who had once believed in forever love had learned that some forevers end, but that doesn't mean the next beginning isn't worth fighting for. Elena's story wasn't about the man who tried to break her. It was about the woman who refused to stay broken, and the love that helped her bloom. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe for more stories like these. Thank you for watching.